It is with pleasure and honor that I moderate this panel. We're going to follow the order of speakers as they appear on the schedule. We're going to be talking about issues that are related to translating poetics. And we begin with Emily Drumsta, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at Brown University. She specializes in modern Arabic and Francophone literatures, and her translations have been published in many venues. And most recently, she has submitted a manuscript of an excellent translation that was supported by a Penheim Award. So, Emily.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. And thank you so much to Qussay for inviting me to be on this panel, and to both Qussay and Sawako, some of the best human beings on the planet at the moment, for organizing this. So yeah, this paper is called Meter, Electricity, Music on Translating the Poetry of Nazik and Malaika. Whatever happened to meter? When did English language poets decide to leave meter and rhyme to rappers and children's book authors? When did rhythm become passé? Who killed the English meters? Today I'll be speaking with you about my experience translating the Iraqi poet Nazik al-Malaika, who is best known as a pioneer of what's called ash-sha'r al-hur in Arabic, and sometimes misleadingly translated as free verse. Since that's what it literally means, but we'll see that it's not that. Since this is a conference about translation and not about Iraq or Iraqi poetry, I'll focus less on Malaika's life and her significance to modern Arabic poetry, and more on sharing my experience doing the impossible, that is, translating Arabic poetry into English. And when people ask me about this, I just say, well, I start with the idea that it's impossible, and then I move on from there. But I'm happy to share more about her life in the Q&A. Specifically, I'll share 2 translated poems with you all, taking you from the original Arabic through a literal English translation, and finally through to a poetic translation. And this work is all part of a forthcoming book, which is called Revolt Against the Sun, for which I've served as an editor and translator. And I'm selecting work from across her very long career in translating it. So by way of rapid-fire background, I'll just say that Nazik al-Malaika was one of the most significant Arab women writers of the 20th century. Born in 1923, over the course of a 4-decade career, she published 7 poetry collections, 4 full-length works of literary criticism, and dozens of articles in the most widely read Arabic literary periodicals of the time. Yet for decades, to read Malaika in English translation was to go hunting through anthologies of Arab women's poetry, while by contrast, nearly every collection by her contemporary Mahmoud Darwish, who is the Arab poet that most of you have probably heard of, nearly all of his collections, each of his collections has been published as its own volume in English, and readers can now peruse several books of Adonis's poetry in English translation too. So they're the ones who made it out. So, though equally as significant to the development of Arab modernism, women like Malaika and her contemporaries have long been relegated to the realm of anthologies. And I'm thinking of poets like Fadwa Khan, May Sayegh, Lamaya Abbas Amara, and many, many others who, my hope is that Revolt Against the Sun takes a crucial first step towards bringing these women's poetry into English as well, and not only in anthologies. As I mentioned before, Malaika's legacy in the world of Arabic letters is built on her reputation as the pioneer of a specific poetic form known in Arabic as ash-sha'r al-hur, and in English as free verse. Let me now quickly explain this form before illustrating how I set out to bring it and other forms that she uses into English. Far from free of metrical regularity, ash-sha'r al-hur isolated the Arabic metrical foot, or taf'ila, as the most basic unit of sound in Arabic poetry. The traditional Arabic poetic line generally consists of 2 hemistichs separated by a caesura. So here you have one of the oldest poems in the Arabic tradition by Labid ibn Rabi'a. This is a manuscript version. So some meters combine 2 different feet in alternating patterns, while others repeat the same foot 3 or 4 times per hemistich. So just to explain, like, the line is divided into 2 hemistichs, and each hemistick has 3 or 4 feet in it. When written down, these poems generally look like 2 columns laid out on the page, leading many modernists to describe them as columnar or amudi, often used pejoratively. In the free verse poetry for which Mala'ika would become famous, by contrast, the poet chooses a single poetic foot to repeat as many or as few times as desired in each line in accordance with the dictates of the poem's thematic content. So rather than have sort of like 3 feet, 3 feet, 3 feet, 3 feet, you can have 1 foot, 4 feet, 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 foot, whatever pattern that you want to do. So the base foot of the meter had to remain the same, and this is why this isn't exactly free verse. There is like a very fixed meter in here. It's just that you have many feet or few feet. And she was very insistent on this point in her criticism, to the point of being sometimes very dismissive of other poets. Mala'ika's reputation as a modernist poet is built both on her experiments in Ash'ar al-Hur and her fierce defenses of this form against advocates of the prose poem, known in Arabic as Qasidat al-Nathr, which is more like our like English free verse, no regular patterns. Mala'ika revered the Arabic meters as indexes of Arab authenticity and uniqueness. She once wrote, quote, "Meter is the soul that electrifies literary material and transforms it into poetry. Indeed, images and feelings do not become poetic in the true sense until the fingers of music touch them and the pulse of meter beats in their veins." Given this reverence for the Arabic meters, it seemed like an injustice to remain only with the literal meanings of Mala'ika's words in my English translations. In many instances throughout the poems I've collected in Revolt Against the Sun, it is clear that Mala'ika has taken liberties either to fill out the meter or to cinch the rhyme in the original. If music and meter were so key to Mala'ika's poetic project, as her prose writings consistently affirm, why not take similar liberties to make the music work in English? The main challenge of translating Nazik al-Mala'ika then lay in finding English verse patterns that would translate the music of the Arabic originals without compromising their images and metaphors. Not only did I have to do a literal translation that would put subjects and objects in their proper places and note any instances of polysemy, paronomasia, antithesis, and other elements of Arabic wordplay, of which there are many, and of which there are many medieval lexicons sort of listing these various wordplays. I then had to set these translations to meter and sometimes rhyme, and in the process I had to address the vast differences between Arabic and English prosody, about which more now. Arabic meters are quantitative, that is, they are based on patterns of long and short vowels undulating in regular patterns, and for this reason the Arabic word for meter, bahr, one of the words for meter is bahr, and this word bahr also means ocean, so this sort of like flowing. English meters, by contrast, are conventionally qualitative, organized around stressed and unstressed syllables. English metrical feet, furthermore, are much shorter than the Arabic taf'ilat, offering only 2 or 3 syllables to the taf'ilas 4 or 5. To recreate a form of metrical music in English for each of Mala'ika's poems, I came up with a number of solutions, but I'll just show you 2 different ones today. Just experiments. First, one of the most important formal questions was how to create something like Ash'ar al-Hur in English. I had a couple of failed experiments that I won't go into right now, though I can also talk more about those. But ultimately, I decided to use iambic rhythms in various line lengths to recreate the rhythm of Mala'ika's free verse poems. My lines, like Mala'ika's, were also of varying lengths, though not necessarily in the same pattern as in the original Arabic. So the original line might have only 3 feet, but mine would have 5 or 6. The iamb offered not only the most flexible, but also the most natural base for this Englishized version of Shi'r Hur in a long poem like For Prayer and Revolution, which is the one that I'll share with you now. So I'll read a little bit of the Arabic original, and then you have my literal translation, and then we'll move into the poetic one. يا قبة الصخرة يا ورد يا ابتهالة مضيئة الفكرة ويا هدى تسبيحة علوية النبرة يا صلوات عذبة الأصداء جاشت بها الأبهاء يا حرقة المجهول يا تعاطش الإنسان للسماء يا ولح الركوع يا طهرة يا وردة الخشوع يا نداه يا عطرة يا مسجدا أسكت تسبيحاته صهيون من أجل حلم وقح مجنون كبل في أرجائه الصلاة والخضرة ولوث المحراب والحضرة. Okay. A key issue in these verses is the Arabic vocative. Ya qubbat al-sakhra. O dome of the rock. This huge O's looming at the front of these lines. In Arabic, the ya is not as forced or antiquated as the O in English. Colloquial Arabic has no issue using ya to address any old thing or person. But in English, you'd never call out to your friend in the cafe across the street by saying, "Oh, Emily." But you would say, "Ya Emel," right? Not a big deal. In an attempt to preserve some of Malaika's rhymes and transmit her regular meters, here's what I came up with in English. To you I call, dome of the rock, to quiet contemplation, to luminescent supplication with a sacred glow. Right guidance of a hymn with holy tones, echoes of prayer booming through your halls. To you, agony of the great unknown, to mankind's longing for the sky, rapture of bowing to the ground. To you, submissive flower, to your dew, to your perfume, masjid whose hymns were hushed by Zionists for an insolent dream. They shackled prayers in your walls and tainted your mihrab. So I hope you can hear some of the free iambic rhythm that I'm trying in here. The second solution that I'd like to share with you today, and with which I will end, is the one I developed for the many poems that Malaika composes in classical amudi structure, columnar structure. The music of these poems' lines relies heavily on the break or breath for which the caesura allows in Arabic. One of the most common ways English translators have dealt with this peculiarity is through indentation. So the single Arabic line is broken into two English ones, with the second indented as though it were an answer to the first. So this is what that usually looks like. But technically, each of these pairs of lines is a single line in the original. This solution felt unnatural for Malaika's verses, where there's often enjambment across the caesura and a sense of unity to the line itself. And I was also just curious to see if there was an English verse form that could embed a sonic caesura where there might not be a printed one. So the solution I arrived at was the 14er, or the Poulter's measure, in which a sonic pause rests easily and unobtrusively between the fourth and fifth of the line's 7 stresses. So William Blake, in particular, loved this metrical pattern. Here's a couple lines from his book of Thel. O life of this our spring, why fades the lotus of the water? Why fade these children of the spring, born but to smile and fall? The sonic association with Blake also, I hope, recreates Malaika's obsession with the English Romantics, and she was a passionate reader of the English Romantics. I use this meter for a number of her poems in classical forms, but one of the most successful, I think, is a song for the moon, أغنية للقمر. So I'll read a little bit of the Arabic original. You have this literal translation here, and then I'll give you the poetic one, and I'll end with that, I promise. Okay. كأس حليب مثلج طرفي أم جدول سائل من الصدف أم غسق أبيض يسيل خدود ليل معطر الصدف أم حق عطر ملون خدل يقطر شهدا لكل مخترف أم أنت خد مزنبق أرج ينعس فوق الأعشاب والسعف. Okay, so you have the literal translation. Remember, I'm trying to use the 14er or the ballad stanza to bring these lines into English in the hopes that they will embed a sonic pause, a recreated caesura where there's no written one in English. So here's a bit of my poetic translation. Sumptuous glass of chilly milk or flowing stream of pearl, white twilight painted on the cheeks of a sweet-smelling night, a colored jar of musk dripping honey with every scoop, or fragrant lily-white cheeks sleeping on cool, dewy grass. What are you, carafe leaking light, stars melting into dark, lily of valley kisses, honey poured in pitch-black night, refuge of beauty, bundled blooms clutched in the sky's soft hands, lips made of light come down to kiss the verdant face of land, a lake of supple jasmine poured out from the firmament, melt bits of beams and dreams in night and drown our roofs in silver, shake off your wings in skies stained with color like butterflies. Without you, shadows would not dance, the iris's tender cups could not be chilled. You wooed our dreams and nursed us beam by beam. O aperture of dawn inside a darkness of fatigue, stay as you are, a secret world our souls can't comprehend. Weaver of poetry's remnants in worlds of darkened mirrors, you make each song mellifluous by shimmering in its folds. You give music its flavor, pulsing meter through its curves. Stay as the fantasies sustaining life. Love, poems, God. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Our next speaker is my colleague, Kate Hedeen, who is a translator of many books of poetry and now is the associated editor for Action Books and the Poetry in Translation editor at the Kenyon Review. She is professor of Spanish at Kenyon College, where she teaches courses on Latin American poetry and translation. She's a recipient of 2 NEA translation grants in the US and a PEN Translates Award in the UK.
Thanks, Qussay. Is this working? Thanks, Qussay. Hello. And thanks to Sawako and Jane and everyone else who made this possible. It's a real honor to be here with all of you today. My talk today is titled Nuestra America, Strategic Positionality in the Politics of Translation. In a recent interview with the online poetry journal Buenos Aires Poetry, Victor Rodriguez Núñez, a contemporary Cuban poet whom I have extensively translated into English, states the following, quote, "Traces of Latin American poetry and North American poetry are almost imperceptible. Sometimes you might see a subtle nod to Vallejo, Neruda, perhaps Borges, but nothing more than that. The poets of the North have turned their backs on us, and this isn't just something happening now, it's been that way always. But even if they don't know us, we know them, and that gives us the advantage." Rodriguez Núñez concludes such ignorance on the part of the poets of the North is intrinsically tied to the lack of poetry in translation in the US. The division between the North and the South that Rodriguez Núñez notes brings me immediately to what another Cuban poet wrote almost 130 years earlier with regard to that same divide. Nuestra America, or Our America, by José Martí, highlights similar tensions on the continent. In this seminal and still incredibly relevant essay, written in the US, which Martí termed the belly of the beast, he warns Latin American intellectuals of the encroaching neo-colonialist and imperialist power of a country that had often served as a political model for 19th century Latin American independence movements. In opposition to it, and in a genius decolonizing move, he proposes a strategic positionality for those intellectuals squarely in Our America, the title itself a subtle critique of the USA's racist usurping of an entire continent's name. This positionality calls for the rejection of foreign influence and privileging of the autochthonous. Just as important, the essay serves to remind intellectuals that thought is activism, that contemplation, often considered to be passive, is actually vital to this struggle. I quote, "We must have no other pillow but our weapons, weapons of the mind, which vanquish all others. Trenches built of ideas are more valuable than those built of stone." End of quote. And that's an Esther Allen translation. I have chosen to highlight the ideas of these two Cuban thinkers because they are ones I return to quite often as I consider my work as a translator of Spanish American poetry into English. On the one hand, Rodriguez Núñez elaborates on the current situation of Spanish American poetry and translation today in the US and Spanish American studies more broadly, as a reaffirmation of the continued imperialist and neocolonialist notion of the US as center and the unidirectional circulation of ideas from north to south, back to north again, that such a notion implies. On the other, Martí offers me as a literary translator a way to respond to this situation through the possibility of a strategic positionality as well as the recognition of my intellectual labor as a valid form of activism. I'll begin by giving you a brief explanation of the current situation of Spanish American poetry and translation in the US. I'm aware I speak from a relative point of privilege with regard to that, the fact that it gets translated and what doesn't get translated here, as Spanish language writing holds a special place in contemporary publication of translation. Though, as all of us in the room know, the numbers are incredibly dismal. Roughly 0.7% of all titles published here in a given year are of literary translation. For literature in Spanish, the 2019 numbers were, according to the 3% database, 21 books of poetry versus 64 books of prose. As for poetry in Spanish and translation, there are two main trends. The first has its beginnings in the 60s when poets like Robert Bly, Clayton Eshelman, John Felsteiner, and James Wright, among others, began translating and publishing Spanish-American poets. None of this is coincidence, of course. We can consider the translation boom as a response on the part of these young U.S. poets to what they consider to be a stale, conventional, formalist, read new criticism poetry in the U.S., bereft of emotion and political commitment. The Cuban Revolution, which triumphed in 1959, also played a role in turning eyes toward the region. Yes, in part, but I would also posture that the phenomenon is intimately tied to the way a U.S. poetry audience thinks poets from these regions should write. From that first boom, there are two who remain continuously in print and with numerous translations, the Chilean Nobel Prize winner Pablo Neruda and the Spanish poet and playwright Federico García Lorca. While these two poets have areas of their work that are undoubtedly avant-garde, much of it can be interpreted as being more in tune with sensuality, feeling, emotion, the body, or hot surrealism, as Bly called it, on the one hand, and on the other, a poetry of witness, obviously political and personal, as Qussay would denominate it in the early 90s. In either case, not necessarily complex, cerebral, or intellectual. We return to a typical colonialist, neo-colonialist dichotomy, as well as a gendered one. South equals sensual, North equals cerebral. Why, for example, are there always so many editions of Neruda's works with commercial presses, and they keep bringing out more, and yet the work of the other great Latin American poet of the 20th century, Peruvian Cesar Vallejo, known for his highly experimental work, is published with university presses and much lesser known among general readers? Why are so many other Spanish-American poets simply not available in English translation? The second and more recent trend would seem to counter the one described above. Independent poetry presses, as well as some translators, over the past 15 years have sought out Spanish-American poets who fall under the umbrella term of marginalized voices in a move that echoes the very popular and successful trend in the U.S. of poetry based on identity politics. In their search to discover the underrepresented, small presses end up proposing, though albeit different, a just as limiting canon, handpicking poets who, in terms of content, often conveniently mirror back to a woke U.S. readership their own concerns and anxieties about representation, and in terms of form, either privilege a direct conventional tone, easily consumable and translatable, or an experimental aesthetic, also based on a mirroring back of US-based definitions of what formal experimentation entails. One unexpected consequence of such a shift is that, in an effort to get their work published in English translation, some young Spanish-American poets have begun to alter their poetics to accommodate the tastes of the hip US poetry consumer. Please don't get me wrong. I applaud these efforts to go beyond borders, and I respect the aesthetic choices of translators. I understand the difficulties, often economic ones, of being a small press in the US. And still, what is unsettling to me in both cases is the question of positionality. Ultimately, the main purpose of such endeavors is what we can get out of Spanish-American poetry. It serves our needs, whether it be a reaction to what's going on in the US literary world or as a way to brand a certain kind of poetry wokeness. And yet the subtle cultural superiority behind such curation can go unchecked. In my view, this kind of a setup is just one more example of the unidirectional circulation between center and periphery. So how to respond to such a situation? I would like to offer up my own experience as one of the possible ways to counter. As a translator, I must recognize my positionality, both the aspects of it that are problematic and its potential for subversiveness. It is clear to me that I am in a privileged position, being based in the US, indirectly benefiting from its neocolonialist, imperialist, racist policies and actions. I am, too, a specialist in Spanish-American poetry. I come from a Hispanic literatures department rather than an English, comparative literature, or creative writing departments. This gives me a different perspective than many literary translators from Spanish into English. Much of the impetus behind why I began to translate has to do with studying Spanish-American poetry, the work of many poets who are well known in the region, and being shocked to find out they are not translated into English. While a part of my approach is based on what might be considered as offering up a counter-canon, I'm more invested in creating an alternative to any canon, be it in the US or Spanish America. I make choices based on this, and the idea of choice, though seemingly obvious, is at the heart of my strategic positionality. I strategically choose poets whose work falls outside the confines of what a US reader might think a poet in Spanish should write like, as well as what Spanish American poetic canons have established as representative for their own readership. I will briefly speak of two. The first I will address is the Uruguayan Eva Batali. Born in 1923 in Montevideo, she is prolific and beloved, though it has been only recently that the Spanish-speaking literary world has begun to appreciate her work. It took Spain until 2018 to award her, at the age of 95, its most prestigious literary honor, the Cervantes Prize, also referred to as the Spanish Nobel. That Batali is only now getting the kind of literary attention she has long deserved, mainly in Spanish, she's still quite unknown in English, can be attributed to one fact: she is hard, in every sense of the word, in ways you never expect. She simply doesn't play by the rules. No fitting neatly into perfectly square boxes, expert declarations about how women write, how Latin Americans write, how Uruguayans write, don't cut it. Just certain kinds of readers want hard, and those certain kinds of readers then want a certain kind of hard. This usually means experimental, but in ways that can be codified and decoded. Added to the mix is gender. The dangerous combination of Batali being a woman poet and an uncompromising thinker. Her poetry is deeply cerebral. The body is absent. Much of the time, so is emotion. There's not one obvious love poem in the whole of her oeuvre. This is not how women should write. If we return to the issue of a very limited Spanish-American poetry and translation canon, these above factors also explain why Batali's poetry is virtually unknown in English. If she doesn't write the way a woman should write for readers in Spanish, just imagine how unappealing her writing could be for U.S. readers of Spanish-American women writers. She's cerebral, she's difficult. This makes her even harder to translate and read in English. But at the same time, she doesn't fall into the limited and limiting definition of what experimental writing is considered to be. Her poetry is not an obvious assault on the senses. It's not overly visual. It doesn't simplistically shock the reader. Just as it isn't pretty or emotional, it isn't ugly either. It is not otherworldly, ethereal, magical, nor is it blatantly political in the facile way so many English language readers have come to expect from Spanish American poets, once again due precisely to a very limited idea of what Spanish American writing is. The second poet is the Ecuadorian Jorge Enrique. He belongs to a pioneering and yet often overlooked group of Spanish-American poets who began to publish in the late 1950s, overlooked in the region because they don't fit neatly into conventional Spanish-American poetry aesthetics, which consider revolutionary ideals and formal experimentation a contradiction. Within these parameters, a poet must choose between the two ends of an apparent spectrum. They both cannot coexist in the poem. This is, of course, a false contradiction, and Hedeen is one, like others I have translated, who challenges it by producing work that is both socially committed and aesthetically experimental. His poetry is some of the most difficult I've encountered: wordplay, neologisms, several different social and cultural registers at once, inclusion of narrativity and chronicle, but at the same time intense lyricism. He is one of the great poets of the region, whose work is unknown to newer generations in Spanish America, and of course to U.S. readers, and suffers a different kind of double marginalization than Batali. What makes his case particularly compelling is that in addition to being of Lebanese descent, his country, Ecuador, has traditionally been considered inferior in literary terms in Spanish American intellectual circles. This then makes his exposure to beyond Spanish America even more difficult. As stated above, at the heart of my strategic positionality are two tenets. First, to respond to a unidirectional US-centric circulation of ideas, and second, to challenge the Spanish-American poetry canon itself and attempt to bring poets who should be better known in Spanish to an English-reading audience. All this being said, I am delighted that we are having this conversation, this conference, this exchange. I'm very grateful for it because I'm constantly reminded that US literary culture, despite its current claims of and calls for diversity, openness, progressiveness, is still fiercely and unabashedly English only. Though if you were to ask any of them, they wouldn't even be aware of it, such is their privilege. The dismal numbers of literary translations shout out to us, but there are whispers too, like not referencing translators in reviews of translation, or not naming the translator on social media. And then there are all-out silences. I have been troubled recently by some of the commentary around the American dirt controversy, and I should clarify only as it relates to translation. Accusations of false representation, the need for authenticity, the question of whose voices get heard, these are literary translator topics. Experts have weighed into the debate, sharing lists of books that can serve as alternatives. They are almost exclusively written by Mexicans in Spanish and presented to the American reader in their English translation, yet this fact of the translator's name is rarely mentioned, and if they are, it comes as an afterthought.
A recent article in the Los Angeles Times reported on a panel that took place regarding the incidents surrounding the book's publication and the subsequent backlash. One of the panelists was feminist and cultural critic Roxane Gay. At one point, she was asked about Flatiron, the publisher of American Dirt, ignoring red flags throughout the editing process. I found her response particularly telling. Gay answered by saying that what had happened with American Dirt, quote, just reinforces what publishing already knows, which is as long as white people are translating the experiences of people of color, it will sell very well. End of quote. On the one hand, I was glad to see the idea of translation mentioned at all in the discussion, and particularly happy of Gay's awareness that it can be wielded in the wrong direction and for colonialist racist agendas. However, I did have a second thought. While she wasn't necessarily referring to literary translation, though she could have been, it brought home to me that the US intellectual elite, even on the left, when they do think about translation, can tend to think of it as only disparagingly, for it is still associated with inaccuracy and inauthenticity, another step away from the real thing. Perhaps this explains why on the same day as the American Dirt Twitter storm, while #NameTheTranslator called for the naming of the translators of Chilean novelist Isabel Allende's latest book into English, another tweet circulated showing the picture of the copyright page from that book. The tweet stated that Allende herself owns the rights to the translation. In other words, the names of the translators were simply not there. From the copyright page, it appears that Allende wrote the book in English too. The tweet went on to explain Allende's practice has always been to acquire those rights for her books in English translation, and it is stipulated in the translator's contract. Suffice it to say, when it comes to positionality, despite being from the South, Allende is firmly in the North. It is precisely because of these challenges that we as literary translators must consider our positionality strategically, just as we must consider our labor our weapon, Marti's weapons of the mind, if you will. Ultimately, as I've explained above, for me to do so as a translator of Spanish American poetry is to attempt to be a part of a multi-directional circulation of ideas and exchange a dialectical relationship to make a move in solidarity with the critique voiced by Rodriguez Núñez at the beginning of this talk. It is opting to help build trenches in and from Nuestra América. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And if you guys see me play with my phone, it's because I'm keeping time. I'm not checking my email, I promise. Our next speaker is Moira Inghilleri, who is professor and director of comparative literature and of translation and interpreting studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is the author of Translation and Migration and also of Interpreting Justice, Ethics, Politics, and Language. She guest edited 2 special issues of the journal The Translator, Bourdieu and the Sociology of Translation and Interpreting, and Translation and Violent Conflict.
Needs to mean something.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to also thank Qussay for the invitation to join this panel. I'm very happy to be here today. Okay. With this simple phrase, no ideas but in things, the American poet William Carlos Williams reiterated the philosophical idea that existence precedes essence, that there can be no ideas of things without the things themselves existing first. With respect to poetry, this meant that words themselves had a materiality. One kind, a sound and a form on the page that conveyed meaning beyond the abstract sense of the words. Another kind, the illocutionary force of a word before it is unpacked. Unlike words in the hands of poets, the words used to describe migrants' reasons for seeking refuge often fail to illuminate the whole landscape of meaning that triggered their departure. Paradoxically, the more stories told, the more they can lose their force and fail to adequately represent the experiences underlying them. Within official institutions involved in migration control, the procedures individuals are obliged to follow, which include filling forms and oral interviews, are designed to produce truncated narratives of harrowing experiences that prevent adequate elucidation of the motivations for fleeing. As a concept, materiality is used across different disciplines to focus attention on the impact of material or physical factors in relation to a particular phenomenon. So in what follows, I'll be presenting just a few examples of alternative media that illustrate the complex phenomenon of migration, using materials not normally viewed as authorized discursive tools for translators or interpreters within most institutional contexts. It would be well outside the norm, for example, to translate a technical manual as a series of paintings, or include a translator's illustrations in a literary translation, or present a film to a border official in support of an asylum request. However, I wish to propose the need for an expanded set of translational norms, institutionally sanctioned, through which narrative content can be framed. I'm going to go through some slides fairly quickly in the interest of time, and in the second half, once I say a few words about each of them, discuss a recently published account of departure and detention that disrupts the canonic refugee narrative forms. So my first slide is to do with the work of Jacob Lawrence, particularly his migration series, which sought to chronicle the northward migration of African Americans from 1915 and continuing over decades, sometimes referred to as the Great Migration, during which time over 6 million people headed to northern and western cities in the US, fleeing the Jim Crow South. The paintings were derived from Lawrence's research and his notes transformed into captions. In 1993, for one of the few tours of the entire series, Lawrence changed its title from The Migration of the Negro to The Migration Series and rewrote the original 1941 captions. The individual agency, I'm just going to have to flip through these pretty quickly. I'm so sorry because they're beautiful to look at. The individual agency involved in the migrants' decisions is illustrated in many of the panels. Others speak directly to the social, economic, and ideological structures that shape the decisions to migrate north. Nizar al-Badr is a sculptor who lives and works in Syria. The book Stepping Stones was initially translated into Arabic as The Threshold of Departure, based on the translator's reading of the text alone. But once he saw Badr's illustrations, he understood the stones as the primary medium of communication. Therefore, they needed to appear in the title, which in Arabic then became The Stones of the Roads, where the stones were both seen as both a hurdle and a sign of progress on the journey. In his memoir, Daoud Hari, a Zagawa tribesman from Western Sudan, he provides a first-hand account of the brutal genocide in Darfur. With his village burned to the ground, Hari escaped, finding safety across the border in Chad. For other eyewitnesses to these atrocities, words were not their preferred mode of expressing their memories. On a fact-finding mission, the NGO Waging Peace was told by Darfuri mothers in a refugee camp in eastern Chad, "If you want information, you should ask the children." She asked the children to write down their memories, and they asked if they could draw instead. These are just some of the examples of what they drew. There's about 100 of these drawings. The drawings were used as evidence to the International Criminal Court of the genocide and what happened. In 2018, the Kurdish Iranian journalist, writer, and scholar Behrouz Bouchani's award-winning book, No Friend But the Mountains, describes his departure and subsequent detention in the Australian-run Manus Island Detention Processing Center in the territory of Papua New Guinea from 2013 until 2019. Bouchani fled Iran due to political and ethnic persecution via a boat journey from Indonesia. He tapped the manuscript out on an iPhone in a series of text messages to the University of Sydney humanities professor Omid Tofigian, who translated the book into English, communicating via social media with little to no direct real-time conversations for long periods of time. Has anyone here actually read the book? Highly recommended. Reading the book, one is keenly aware of Tofigian's attempts to ensure that Bucciani's acute reflections about how humanity and inhumanity interact within the camp are not diminished. Part fiction, journalism, autobiography, philosophy, poetry, psychology, and political commentary, the book is a searing portrayal of the role of prolonged detention in contemporary migration policies. I was particularly struck by Bucciani's attention to specific artifacts present in the camp to underscore how power and control were employed. These transhuman objects became a mode of translation, for Bucciani. And I'd like to elaborate this idea of the meaningfulness of everyday objects through a poem by William Carlos Williams entitled A Sort of Song. He writes, "Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words, slow and quick, sharp to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless, through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose, no ideas but in things, invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks." Saxifrage is also called rock breaker, which is the translation of its botanical name, saxifraga, or stonebreaker from the Latin saxum, which is rock or stone, and frangere, to break. Like the flower, despite the totalizing institutional conditions on Manus Island, Bucciani manages to break through and expose its harshest practices. The poem becomes a sort of song to the creative process. Williams proposes the writer as a snake, acutely watchful from a point hidden from view, alert and tireless in its observing, bringing together the realm of the human and the existential realm of things, people and stones. In Williams' poetry, sharp, concrete images not only precede ideas about them, but open us up to the sudden and concentrated illumination of a whole landscape. There is a clear parallel in Bucciani's method of working through some of the bare existential things he observes in his position as detainee. These are just some of the images referred to in the book that lingered long after my first reading. And I only have time to just read one short excerpt where the generator is invoked. He writes, "As midnight draws closer, the prisoners retire to their foam mattresses, return to sleep after a day of commotion. Suddenly, the generator quits. Again. Another hammer clobbers the head of the prison. Everyone's hopes and dreams maneuver in tandem with the unbearable intensity of heat, seeping alongside each other into the tapestry of a nightmare. Startled out of sleep, the prisoners wake, sweating heads bursting as though in a furnace. Not to forget the mosquitoes. Now, without any fans operating, the mosquitoes venture more ruthlessly into the rooms. Within minutes, the prisoners escape the rooms and drop directly into the black of night, unleashing a monsoon of profanities. The swearing echoes through the abyss of darkness that restrains the prison. A device resembling someone of old age, constituted by an intricate system of deteriorating wires, poles and pipes of rusting metal, probably within a dingy space, somewhere worse than the prison, covered by an old cloth, under the protection of a rag that is withering away. The generator is withering away. I want to believe the generator is a living being with a soul, an organism that takes pleasure in throwing the prison into disarray whenever it feels like it. So the art and artifacts I presented here employ a mode of translation that has as its aim to testify, protest, reflect, make visible, and ultimately to educate and allow us to better understand the overlap and intimacy that exists between human and non-human, verbal and nonverbal features of the migration experience. Each demonstrates how translation, as a medium of communication, has the power to shape human association and action. Lawrence's abstraction from the literal and his use of form was his bridge to a commentary on the broader human level, a view without obstacles or restricted perspective, but with an immediacy of presence. The same can be said, I'm going to just, because I think I have a little bit of time, go back to just look at some of these while I'm speaking of them. Bader's stone images and the work produced by refugees living indefinitely in detention camps in Africa, Australia, and offshore Pacific islands. The reflective semantic process, vividly portrayed in all their work, is reminiscent of translators' attempts to get each shade of meaning exact against a background of alternative meanings. The work brings something to life, to consciousness, in a way that neither transcends or is unfaithful to the particular experience it represents. These matters become irrelevant to some extent. What is relevant is their ability to illuminate meaning in a new way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moira. And our last but certainly not least speaker is Julie Swenson, who translates poetry, prose, and art criticism from French and won the 2004 PEN USA Award in Literary Translation. She divides her time between Paris and Providence, where she teaches at Brown University. She has published 17 volumes of poetry, most recently on Walking On, the author of a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise, and the co-editor of the Norton Anthology of American Hybrid. She has been a finalist twice for the LA Times Book Award and once for the National Book Award, and has been awarded the Iowa Poetry Prize and the National Poetry Series.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. It's been great hearing everything. It's just wonderful. The piece I'm reading is called Material Tonality. I was rereading Merleau-Ponty's Cézanne's Doubt the other day when I encountered the statement, quote, "The artist is the one who arrests the spectacle in which most people take part without really seeing it, and who makes it visible to the most human among them." While I thought about that statement before, I'd never thought about it in relation to translation. But suddenly, the connection seemed blatant. Is not the translator the one who arrests the text that most people read without reading its entirety, and who makes legible, etc.? Or even the one who reconfigures the text so more of its entirety is legible to most people who read extremely meticulously? For a text is never available in its entirety, though there is a way that translation can make elements otherwise buried in a text suddenly available, make aspects that may be merely latent in the original newly apparent. I know I've had, and I imagine that most of us have had, the experience of reading a text that we know well, both in its original and in translation, and have been struck by the difference, had the sense, in fact, of reading a different text, not just in sound, rhythm, and texture, but in content as well. This is often due, I believe, to the way that different emphases operate to shine the light of the reader's eye on different nuances, different details, different associations and connections. As a text cannot be separated from its material body, the material transformation necessitated by translation necessitates a dramatic change in all the relationships that interweave, so that different proximities, different echoes, different affinities emerge, meaning that even the most faithful translation necessarily says something quite different, but not something that wasn't already there in the text waiting for the right reshuffle to bring it to life. In this way, translation can bring out elements of content that are inherent in the text, but that are not available in any other way than through translation. And of course, every target language will bring out different latent elements, making the content of a given text only limited by the number of currently living languages. One of the things that this material transformation touches on most is tone. Though we don't always think of it as such, tone is entirely dependent upon materiality. I think about it a lot because I keep finding myself embroiled in translations that, I realize at one point or another, are more tone than anything else. I've always been particularly aware of tone as recalcitrant in relation to translation, precisely because it's so heavily based on materiality. Whether a word slips or snags, whether it's plump or spare, does as much to embody irony, tenderness, sarcasm, or any other tonal effect as does its semantic meaning. And of course, just as with any other textual element, one can't replicate those material tonalities on the spot. They end up distributed throughout the text. But stopping to consider what textual strategies the writer used to achieve a given tone can be very helpful in trying to construct its equivalent in English. I'm going to share pieces from two recent projects in which tone seems to be 9/10 of the problem. One is Hervé Letellier's Atlas Inutilis, and the other is Michel Grangot's A Poet's Calendar. In the interest of time, I'll economize on their bios, but they're easy to find online. I will just note, however, that both are members of the Oulipo, though their writing, their projects, and their senses of constraint have nothing else in common. Hervé Letellier's tone is tongue-in-cheek, with a verbal sleight of hand redolent of the stand-up comic. And as with everything comic, timing is everything. He orchestrates it marvelously, arranging his syntax so that his punchlines fall with the feel of the inevitable. It's also a subtly but forcefully smooth syntax. There's a sleek, even slippery quality that operates like a sly, sideways, knowing wink. The project soon became a matter of getting English to slither in a similar way. Creating longer than usual sentences with lots of embedded clauses turned out to be very helpful, and intentionally creating sentences that didn't even approach, but hinted at the possibility of approaching the ridiculous, which was often aided by the finagling of phrasing required to get the key word to land at the end of the phrase or sentence. Helpful, too, was concentrating on the potential of sound as momentum, so that sound pulls the ear through the piece with, one hopes, the mind not far behind. So we're going to read a few pieces, and Arita is going to read the French so that you can hear the tonality there, and then I'll read the English, and we'll go piece by piece. Thank you.
Les chercheurs du Gödel Institute for Logic ont prouvé que pour poser au milieu d'une pelouse un panneau interdit de marcher sur la pelouse, il a chaque fois été nécessaire de marcher sur la pelouse.
Philosophers at the Gödel Institute for Logic have definitively proved that in order to erect a sign that says "No walking on the lawn" in the middle of a lawn, someone has to walk on the lawn.
On a longtemps cru que les hommes de la vallée du Grofal, Andes du Sud, portaient d'énormes faux sexes, comme les femmes de nos contrées portent de longs faux cils. En fait, non.
For a long time, it was thought that the men of the Grofal Valley wore enormous false penises, like the women of our country wear false eyelashes. But in fact, no.
Une erreur malheureuse d'un graveur, en mars 1890, sur le fronton de la mairie d'Équevillé, Picardie, a transformé la devise de la République française, liberté, égalité, fraternité, en ébriété, égalité, fraternité. Les élus ne s'aperçurent de la faute qu'en janvier 1907, mais il était trop tard.
An unfortunate error on the part of a stonecutter working in March 1890 on the front of the town hall of Écuvilliers in Picardy turned the well-known slogan of the French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, into inebriety, equality, fraternity. Local officials didn't notice the error until January 1907, and by then it was too late. The other project, Michel Grangot's A Poet's Calendar, Calendrier des Poètes, has in some ways opposite tonal issues. The book goes through the year, day by day, stating 2 or 3 things that happened to writers or artists or characters in books on each day. The year is never given, creating an odd equality across centuries that's reinforced by its all being presented in the present tense. Every day is now. And in keeping with that, her tone is almost aggressively flat, assertively, though calmly, direct. Though the work masquerades as simply factual, the sentences are all finely engineered to appear stylistically neutral, which is, of course, a style in itself. So in this case, the project became a matter of replicating the style of the stylistically unmarked, a fake transparency that claimed language as sheerly a vehicle for the factual information that it was, as always, not conveying, but creating. In this case, short sentences with repetitive and simple syntaxes of the subject plus verb plus direct object variety were helpful, along with an avoidance of overt sound relationships that might draw attention to the language rather than to its information. And I haven't done the month of February, otherwise I would have chosen today and the next 2 days. But I chose the first 3 days of April in honor of April's being Poetry Month. So.
1er avril. Ayant inventé la forme dite poème du jour, Jacques Jouet commence aujourd'hui un journal de poèmes. Sous la palmeraie, il y a une tasse bleue.
April 1. Having invented a form called Poem of the Day, Jacques Jouet begins a journal of poems. In the palm grove, there is a blue cup.
2 avril. Plusieurs indices laissent supposer que M. Tchoulkatourine est mort dans le courant de la nuit dernière. Victor Ségalen, Gilbert de Voisin et le préfet de Jahoua se retrouvent devant la tombe de Boa Sangnian dans la province de Sichuan. Ségalen prend des photos. François-René de Chateaubriand publie ce jour la description des chutes du Niagara dans Atala.
April 2. Certain details indicate that Mr. Katherine died sometime during the previous night. Victor Ségalen, Gilbert de Voisin, and the prefect of Zahoua meet before Bao Sanang's tomb in the province of Sichuan. Ségalen takes photographs. On this day, François-René Chateaubriand publishes a description of Niagara Falls in Atala.
3 avril. Ettore Schmidt promet pour la dernière fois de ne plus fumer. Voltaire et le président de Brosse sont reçus à l'Académie de Dijon. Samuel Johnson entreprend le second volume de son dictionnaire en laissant de la place pour la préface, la grammaire et l'histoire, aucun de ces chapitres n'étant commencé.
April 3. Ettore Schmidt promises for the last time to stop smoking. Voltaire and President de Brosse are received at the Academy of Dijon. Samuel Johnson begins work on the second volume of his dictionary, leaving space for the preface, the grammar, and the history, none of these chapters having yet been started. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colin, for the wonderful panel. And we do have about 11 minutes for questions and answers. And we will not let you go for lunch until we conclude that time. So please, if you have questions, please shoot them. Zach.
Hi, thanks everyone. I had a question for Emily and the work that you're doing, translating that poetry. The question's mainly about the second kind of meter that you're interested in, not the free verse, but the columnar ones. I'm interested in the role of something like typography or punctuation in the product. It seems like when translating from a script that looks so different from the English language visually, those choices are interesting. And yet when I was looking at your translations, I felt you were going for a certain minimalism. You wanted the translation to be carried by the meter acoustically and not visually. At the same time, you were doing interesting things with punctuation, I thought. The commas, the question marks, the capitalization. I wonder if you had things to share.
Yes, so I actually, I should probably look again at the punctuation because my focus throughout was really on the sonic. But in that poem, I felt like it's easy to forget that each of those, like it's all a series of questions of like, what is the moon? Is it all of these sort of really sensuous, which of these really sensuous things is it? And then like, it's sort of the rhetorical question is it's all of them and none of them, and like this like asymptotic attempt to approach what it really is. So yeah, I didn't think that hard about punctuation, but for that one I wanted the question marks to remind that that's where we were working. And sometimes like I feel like I use it to, I think I'm being really like phonocentric. Like I just use it to make sound or to make pauses or to remind about questions and things like that. But you're right that my focus is on the sonic.
Yes, well, this question also is for you, Emily. I was wondering, in sort of follow up on the question that was just asked, why not leave the caesuras in the English line? And what about syllabic verse? Because I was thinking, given that the associations with formalist English language poetry, right? And for an English language speaker's ear, once you start to hear certain rhythms, right, certain meters, you associate it with certain kinds of poetry. And so, I mean, I guess I was just wondering about that as a question. And I also wanted to ask just one quick question to Kate. Could you say just a little bit more about the two poets, Batali and Hedeen? And you gave this wonderful description of their work, and now, of course, I want to go read it. But could you? And you didn't offer any translations. So could you just say just a little bit more about the complexities and how you work through those?
Should I go first? So is the question sort of like why not just syllabic? Why choose accentual syllabic?
Exactly. So why not, given that the correspondence?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No problem. Given that I don't know Arabic, but just given the differences between the Arabic feet and English language, Anglophone poetry's feet, the long tradition, right? Would not syllabic verse work, right? But also in the sense of sort of capturing that difference, but we're preserving the feet. But then, in addition to that, what about keeping that caesura? Because visually, I mean, if you read it, it was interesting when you were reading it, that the breath in the Arabic, you could actually carry that into English and you would still keep,
Yeah, so I think that's sort of the answer right there. I wanted to see because I just don't, maybe Qussay can correct me, but it doesn't always read as it just seems like two different. I think it could read differently in English. You would never do an Arabic reader would never read like this, like these hemistichs and then these hemistichs. Whereas I feel like there's the temptation once you lay it out like that in English there's a temptation to read it both ways. And I didn't really want that to happen. And I really wanted to see if I could do it. And the 14, Blake, from 1789, emerged and was like, here's the Poulter's measure, please use it. So if it hadn't been, if I felt like it hadn't I couldn't make it work, then I would have tried something else. And then as far as the syllabic, I don't hear, when I'm only counting syllables, I don't hear it. And Robert Haas's little book on form was really helpful with thinking about how, he has this whole thing that the dactyl doesn't exist in English because we'll just always put the stress first. So it just felt like I couldn't hear it if I just was counting syllables. So, and she loved the British Romantics, and these, I took from Keats, I took from Blake, sort of in an homage to that. Yeah.
Thanks, John, for asking me to talk a little bit more. I, in an attempt to be efficient with my time, I didn't really go into the intricacies of how to translate this work. Eva Batali's work has, there have been some translations that have come out online. Adum, I actually have a chapbook, and the collection that I translated will be coming out in a year. In general, though, I will say that just both of these poets, and actually more and more the poets that I'm attracted to in terms of wanting to translate them, tend to be what we would consider to be hard or difficult or experimental, and which was not the case when I first started, right? But it's actually allowed me that experimentation has allowed my own creativity in a way to blossom, and I no longer shy away from things that are hard. They're hard in very different ways. I would say that Adum is a poet that you would, neo-avant-garde, in the sense that he's doing a lot of things that don't make sense. He's playing with words on a page. He's inventing words, those kinds of things. So he's a bit more accessible to us in English for folks who want to read experimental work. He's a challenge, but he's a fun challenge. Ida is actually much more difficult than Adum because she's not being conventionally experimental. She just has very difficult syntax. She's very conceptual. I don't know what she's talking about. A lot of the time I have to really, really concentrate on understanding her train of thought. I'd be happy to share those links with you if you're interested in seeing more of the work. Thank you.
I've got a question for Cole. Could you talk a little bit more about the connection between tone and materiality and how you understand materiality?
I was thinking of, again, the words shape and texture and how much, as I say, if a word is, if there's a series of short single-syllable words giving a kind of staccato effect that carries tone. And I think that if, for instance, I'm just going to give a simplistic example, it probably would not give you a tender tone. If you were going for tenderness, you probably, and totally intuitively, would simply choose perhaps something that is smoother or softer words, etc. So I think we tend to think that tone is achieved semantically through semantic nuance, but I think that the materiality, the actual sound qualities and rhythmic qualities have a lot to do with conveying that emotional level.
This would be an excellent note to conclude our panel, and we're right on time, so I thank my co-panelists and thank you all for listening. Thank you.